James Thornton stepped off the red double-decker bus onto the wide pavement outside Buckingham Palace. The morning air carried a faint chill, and the sun peeked through broken clouds, casting soft light on the palace's stone facade. James loved London more than any city he had ever visited. He had arrived early, hoping to beat the crowds and soak in every detail of this grand place. His faithful companion, a stout English bulldog named Winston, waddled at his side. Winston's favorite things were treats, pats on the head, and sniffing every possible lamppost. Today, he seemed especially curious, his nose twitching as he took in the new surroundings. Tour groups gathered in loose clusters, their guides waving bright flags and speaking in hurried voices. Cameras clicked and whirled, capturing tourists, posing on the palace steps, gawking at the famous gates. Guard Corporal Mitchell stood alone, motionless and straight-backed. Dressed in the iconic red tunic and towering black bearskin hat, his face remained expressionless behind the stiff uniform, a living picture of discipline. Behind him, another guard matched his stance exactly, forming a perfect pair. James gripped Winston's leash loosely. The bulldog had chestnut-brown fur with white patches, jowls that hung low, and eyes that seemed always half-closed in a sleepy, friendly gaze. Winston was used to strolls in James's quiet neighborhood park, where people smiled at him and children offered him biscuits. Today was different. Here the crowd buzzed with excitement, and the palace gates loomed like an ornate fortress. James paused to adjust his camera strap and let Winston sniff around a bronze plaque set into the pavement. A short distance away, a sign stood on a metal post. "No, pets allowed beyond this point." James glanced at it, then at Winston, whose head was buried in the plaque's metal frame. Winston gave a happy grunt and pulled back slightly as if proud of his discovery. "Good boy, Winston," James murmured. He loved the gentle rumble of Winston's voice, but he was also aware of the sign, tugged Winston back toward the palace entrance, hoping the guard wouldn't notice. He had read that these red-coated sentries were not allowed to speak or move unless ordered. He doubted they would break their rigid stance over a little dog. As James lifted his camera to take a photo of the palace gates, a sudden breeze sent the tour guide's flag billowing. The bright yellow fabric snapped like a sail, catching Winston's attention. The bulldog's ears perked up. He let out a low growl mixed with a curious snort. Winston strained at the leash. His stubby legs churned against the pavement slabs, and James realized with a shock that Winston was tugging harder than usual. Tourists nearby turned to watch. Winston's growl became a bark, loud and surprised, echoing strangely against the palace walls. The leash jerked out of James's hand. In the blink of an eye, Winston was free. James's heart lurched. "Winston? No," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the clamor of the crowd. Winston lunged forward, his body low and barrel-chested, charging straight at the nearest guard. Guard Corporal Mitchell reacted with perfect discipline. In a world of motion, he remained a statue until the last possible moment. Then instinct took over. He was trained to stay calm under pressure. As Winston thundered toward him, Mitchell shifted his weight back just enough to let the bulldog pass harmlessly beneath his outstretched arms. His bearskin hat tilted forward, hiding his eyes, and hundreds of tourists gasped in unison. Time seemed to slow. Winston barked again, a sharp sound that split the hush. His jaws snapped shut just past Mitchell's knee, missing the guardsman's polished boots by inches. The crowd froze. Some people stared with wide eyes. Others raised their phones too. Record James ran forward, stunned by the speed of events. "I'm so sorry, Winston. Stop it," cried, sliding on the pavement as he tried to grab the leash. Winston, sensing freedom, skidded in a small circle, tongue lolling, then turned back toward James. The dash had only lasted a second or two, but in that moment reality shifted. The once fearsome guard stood motionless, the barking dog in front of him. Tourists whispered to each other, wondering what would happen next. Corporal Mitchell held his position. No shouting, no gun drawn, no harsh words. He simply admired the flawlessness of his training. The crowd held its breath. Even Winston paused, nose twitching, as if uncertain whether this red-coated giant would strike. Then the unthinkable happened. Mitchell bent one knee, lowering himself toward Winston. He extended a gloved hand and offered a soft pat to the bulldog's head. He spoke in a voice so quiet no one but Winston could hear. Maybe he said, "Easy, boy." Maybe he just hummed. A reassuring tone. Winston's eyes brightened. He wagged his stubby tail and leaned into the pat. Laughter rippled through the crowd. A wave of relief broke the tension. James arrived beside the pair, panting, face flushed with embarrassment and relief. He scooped up Winston's leash and knelt down. "Thank you," he said, voice trembling. "I am so sorry, sir. He's usually so calm." Mitchell rose without a word, pat Winston on the shoulder one last time, and gave James a formal salute. His bearskin hat settled back into place, his face as unreadable as before. The crowd burst into applause and cheers. Smartphones clicked, and word nonstop. People shouted, "Brilliant! Well done, guard. Best moment ever." James straightened slowly, dusting himself off. He managed a shaky smile. He turned to the tourists, pointing at him, and blurted, "Yes, yes. Everything's fine. Sorry for the scare." Then he looked at Mitchell. "Thank you, Corporal." Mitchell gave a slight nod, turned back to his station, and resumed his statue-like pose. But something had changed. The stiff guard stood just a fraction less rigid, a small point of warmth hidden behind the bearskin. James felt gratitude surge through him. He clipped the leash back onto Winston's collar and bowed his head in respect. The tourist guide resumed his story about the palace's history, but no one listened. All eyes were on Winston and the guard. James knew this moment would follow him everywhere in his memories. In the photos now on every tourist's phone and in the social media posts sure to come, he took a deep breath, looped one arm around Winston and turned to rejoin his group. Tourists whispered behind his back, and James smiled at them shyly. Winston leaned against James's leg, tongue hanging out, panting happily. James knelt and stroked Winston's soft ears. "You're something else, buddy," he whispered. Winston looked up at him with those sleepy eyes, as if he understood and approved of every bit of excitement he had caused. James lifted his head and glanced back at the palace gates. The second guard still stood as motionless as a marble statue. Yet the scene felt different now, alive with that brief, perfect connection between man and dog in red uniform. The palace itself seemed a little less distant, a little more human. They walked on, James determined to keep a tighter grip on Winston's leash from now on. But inside his heart, a spark of wonder remained. He had come to London seeking history and grandeur, but what he found was a moment of kindness that transcended every rule, and that memory would last far longer than any photograph. James's heart pounded as he watched Winston break free. The bulldog's leash slipped through his fingers like water through a sieve. In that instant, time felt strange slow for James, but fast for Winston. One moment James was standing safely. Behind the crowd, and the next, he saw his dog charging toward the royal guard. Winston's stout body moved with surprising speed. His short legs pumped hard, and his jowls flapped with each bounding step. He looked fierce, but also a bit confused. The guard in the bright red coat and tall bearskin hat stood still, just inches from the palace gates. To James's shock, Winston seemed to aim straight for Corporal Mitchell. Round them, tourists froze. Some stared with open mouths. Others raised their phones, ready to capture what might be an accident or a moment of chaos. A small child tugged her mother's skirt and whispered, "Is the dog going to bite him?" The mother hushed her, but even she held her breath. James sprinted forward, arms flailing. "Winston, stop!" he yelled. His voice was rough with panic. Thought about grabbing the leash, throwing himself in front of his dog Neething too. Protect the guard. But the crowd was too tight. He reached out, but he was still too far away. Winston closed the distance in seconds. He snarled once and barked, a deep, startling sound that echoed against the stone walls. The guard reacted at last. In perfect slow motion, James saw Corporal Mitchell lean to one side. His boots clicked on the pavement as he shifted his weight. his uniform creaking softly. Winston raced past Mitchell's ankles, barking again. People gasped. The bulldog's massive head came close enough that his whiskers almost brushed the guard's shin. Then, as if sensing danger or perhaps respect, Winston skidded to a stop. His paws scraped the ground, leaving faint scuff marks on the gray slabs. For a moment, neither Winston nor the guard moved. The guard's bearskin hat tilted forward just enough to hide his eyes. He looked statuesque, yet the tilt hinted at something human beneath the stiff uniform around them. The crowd held its collective breath. James reached the spot where it all had happened. His chest heaved. He could taste the metallic temps of fear on his tongue. He saw Winston standing in front of the guard, head low, tail stiff. The bulldog's ears were pinned back. He looked at James, then at the guard, uncertain which way to turn. James crouched down, mere feet away from the guard. He didn't want to get closer. He was afraid of making things worse, but he needed to calm Winston. "Easy, Winston," he said in a soft voice, the same voice he used at home to soothe his dog on thunderstorm nights. His tone carried the promise of safety. Winston blinked once, then barked again, lower and less fierce this time. He stamped one paw. James's heart sank. He realized that Winston might not obey unless someone took the lead. But the guard was still silent, still watchful. A sudden thought struck James. The guard was trained to stay calm under pressure. Maybe if he showed no fear, Winston would feel safer. James straightened his back, lifted his chin, and called Winston's name again. "Winston, come here, boy." The bulldog paused, his head tilted. Then, in a quick decision that surprised everyone, Winston turned away from the guard. He bounded toward James, tongue lolling, eyes bright, let out a shaky laugh of relief. The crowd exhaled with him. He slipped the leash through his hand and clipped it back onto Winston's collar. He patted Winston's broad head as if to say, "Good boy," though his voice trembled. The tourists, too, shook free from their shock and started whispering among themselves. Some cheered softly. Others snapped photos of Winston and James, framed by the palace gates and the red-coated guard. James looked up at Corporal Mitchell. The guard had remained motionless. No rifle drawn, no harsh rebuke. He simply stood at attention, watching. James bowed his head, apologizing with his posture. He had broken the no-pets rule, risked a guard's safety, and caused a scene. He felt shame wash over him. Then, something unexpected happened. The guard lifted his right hand in a crisp salute. It was as formal as any military gesture, but here, it felt also like a sign of respect.
Ow.
James pressed a hand over his heart and mimicked the salute. His fingers shook. Winston sat obediently beside James, panting. His chest heaved like a little bellows. James patted Winston's side again, this time with more warmth than fear. "I'm sorry, sir," he said to the guard, voice low but steady. "He's a good dog. He never does this." The guard did not speak. That was part of his role, no talking, no smiling. Yet his eyes, dark and calm behind the bearskin's brim, seemed to soften. He shifted his stance just a fraction, foot turning slightly outward. It was the smallest sign, but James felt it like a gift. The guard understood. Tourists around them began to clap quietly at first, then louder. Few laughed, pointing at the odd scene. A bulldog that had almost attacked a royal guard, and a guard who remained calm. James looked around. He saw cameras pointed, children smiling, even the palace staff peeking out from behind a side door. A tiny butterfly of relief fluttered in James's chest. He patted Winston one more time, then gently nudged him toward the crowd. "Come on, boy," he whispered. Winston wagged his stubby tail and followed his leash firmly in James's grip. This time, as they walked away, James heard bits of conversations. "Did you see that? The guard didn't even move. Best thing I've ever seen at Buckingham Palace. That dog is braver than most people." James nodded at grateful tourists, offering smiles and murmured apologies. He felt proud of Winston, brave, curious, and a little wild. And he felt grateful to Corporal Mitchell, brave in a different way, calm under unexpected pressure. They reached a small side street, where the crowd thinned. James finally released a long breath. He turned to Winston and scratched behind his ears. Winston closed his eyes and leaned into the touch. Let's try to follow the rules from now on, James murmured. Winston opened one eye and gave James that half-asleep bulldog look as if to say, "What rules?" James laughed softly. He knew it would be hard to keep Winston perfectly behaved, but he would try. They rejoined their tour group near a souvenir stand. James bought Winston a small bone-shaped biscuit and fed it to him. Winston's tail wagged twice, then thumped against James's leg in delight. James patted him on the back. "That's for being a good guard inspector," he joked. Tourists nearby chuckled. As the group moved on, James took one last glance at the palace gates. The guards had resumed their statuesque positions. The large crowd had shifted back to normal tourist chatter. Yet James knew something had changed. No one would ever visit Buckingham Palace and only think of its history or architecture again. They would think of the day a bulldog nearly broke protocol and the day a royal guard showed kindness in return. James clipped Winston's leash with care and led him toward the next landmark. He whispered to the bulldog, "I'll get you." A treat later, and Winston bobbed his head. James smiled and guided Winston through the streets, feeling both humbled and exhilarated by what had just happened. He could not wait to tell his friends back home. And he felt certain that his story would be one he told for the rest of his life. James and Winston walked away from the palace gates, but the energy of what had just happened still hummed in the air. James could feel people's eyes on him as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. Some whispered excitedly to each other, pointing at their phones as they replayed the short videos they had just captured. He could almost hear the sea of murmurs. "Did you see that? I can't believe the guard didn't get mad. That dog is famous now." James glanced down at Winston, who trotted beside him, tail wagging like a small banner of triumph. He gave the bulldog a reassuring pat. "You did great, buddy," he murmured. Winston let out a soft snort of approval. The leash was snug in James's hand now. No more surprises, he promised himself. They rejoined their small tour group, which had paused by a red telephone booth. The guide, a cheerful woman named Emma, cleared her throat.
"Oh,
"That was certainly an expected moment," she said with a nervous laugh. Faces turned toward James, and he cringed at the attention. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Sorry about that," he said quietly. Winston got excited. Emma smiled kindly. "No harm done, and thanks to that brave guard, too." James found himself smiling at the memory of Corporal Mitchell. The image of the tall, stiff guard kneeling so gently beside Winston was one he knew he would carry forever. He looked back at the palace one more time, trying to memorize every detail of that moment. Meanwhile, hundreds of feet away, crowds streamed out of cafes and shops, their screens glowing with the latest social media posts. Within minutes, videos of Winston's charge and Mitchell's calm response were trending on every platform. The hashtag Bulldog and the guard shot up, and people around London stopped in the street to watch the looping clips. Some laughed aloud, some gasped again, as if seeing it for the first time. Across the city, news outlets scrambled to get the full story. James and his group moved past a souvenir stall where the vendor grinned at them. "Mate, did you see the dog incident?" he asked. "Everyone's talking about it. I've had customers in here buying all the Royal Guard hats, saying they want to remember this day." He held up a miniature bearskin cap, nearly as big as Winston's head. James exchanged a sheepish look with Emma, then with Winston. The bulldog looked at the cap, head tilted, as if judging its authenticity. They continued down the street toward St. James's Park. Tall trees lined the walkway, and the path curved beside a small lake where ducks glided on the water. The guide pointed out a flock of pelicans in their enclosure. James smiled politely, but his mind was on the palace event. He felt a mixture of pride and embarrassment. He was proud that Winston had shown such spirit and that the guard had responded so kindly. He was embarrassed that he had lost control of his dog and almost caused a serious problem. As they rounded the bend, James's phone buzzed. He fumbled to pull it from his pocket while keeping an eye on Winston, who was already sniffing at the grass. The screen was flooded with notifications, messages from friends, tags in social media posts, news alerts. He tapped one and read a headline, "English Bulldog vs. Royal Guard. Tourist dog charges palace. Guard befriends canine." A link from a major news site showed a still image of Winston mid-bark, facing the kneeling guard. The caption read, "In a surprising show of calm, the guard wins over the dog's loyalty." James felt his cheeks warm. He opened another alert. A friend had sent him a short message. "Dude, your dog is internet famous." He tapped back, lol. "I know. I can't believe it." He thought about calling his partner at home, eager to share the story. He pictured the smile on her face. He felt a surge of warmth. Winston's leash slipped from James's hand again for a moment as the bulldog lunged toward a squirrel darting across the path. The squirrel escaped up a tree, and Winston looked back at James, tongue lolling. "Focus, buddy," James said. The dog sat obediently, head cocked. They reached a bench by the lake. Ma suggested they take a break. Tourists settled on the wooden slats, some feeding crumbs to ducks, others scrolling through their phones. James joined them, crouching to give Winston a small water dish he had packed. The bulldog drank eagerly. James refilled it, then leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment to rest. He could hear people behind him still discussing the palace moment. "That guard was incredible," one voice said. "He could have yelled or even fired a warning shot, but he chose kindness." Another added, "It was like a scene from a movie." James opened his eyes and looked at Winston, who had flopped onto his side, belly up, waiting for a rub. James scratched Winston's chest gently. Winston blinked slowly, completely content. After a few minutes, Emma gathered the stones in her hand. "All right, everyone, let's move on to the rose garden." Tourists stood and the group began walking again. James clipped Winston's leash onto his belt and followed. The roses bloomed in bright reds, pinks, and yellows. Visitors lingered to take photos among the bushes. James stood back, taking mental snapshots of their smiles. Still, the palace moment lingered like a spark in his mind. He thought about how a potential crisis had become a celebration of calm and kindness. He thought about the millions of people who would watch the video and feel a tingle of hope that even in strict, rule-bound places there was room for compassion and humor. Back near Buckingham Palace, Corporal Mitchell had returned to his post. He stood tall, but something felt different. His fellow guard noticed the small fur mark on his boot. Winston's sniff had almost brushed him. During the lunch break, the guards exchanged whispers. Mitchell quietly asked the canteen sergeant for some dog treats, explaining in low tones that the bulldog seemed harmless and that perhaps offering a treat could prevent future runs. The sergeant smiled and supplied a small bag of biscuits. Mitchell tucked the bag into his tunic pocket, careful not to show it as he resumed his silent vigil. Occasionally, a tourist dog would sniff at his boots, hoping for a treat. Mitchell would gently offer one biscuit, then expertly return to his stance. Overhead cameras recorded every moment. Palace security reviewed the footage and noted the guard's calm demeanor. Later, his superiors would commend him for de-escalating a security risk with minimal fuss. Meanwhile, James and the group left the garden and began heading toward the mall. The wide boulevard stretched ahead, flanked by trees and statues. James stopped to look at Admiralty Arch in the distance. He snapped a quick photo of Winston sitting obediently. The bulldog's stubby profile framed by the cheering tourists trailing behind. He posted it to his social media, captioning it, "When your dog almost gets you in trouble, but saves the day with charm. #Winston a Bulldog, #Royal Guard." Within moments, the post received likes and comments. "Amazing. That's Winston for you. Britain needs more gentle giants like that guard." James smiled at the flood of positive messages. He tapped back to one commenter. He really was incredible. As they walked, James reflected on how small moments could spread far and wide. A dog's curiosity, a guard's training, and a few seconds of gentle kindness had turned a tense scene into a story millions would share. He thought about how he could tell this story to his children one day, about how Winston and the guard taught him that rules are important, but so is compassion. They reached Trafalgar Square, where street performers juggled and musicians played. Winston sat patiently next to a fountain, watching the hustle. Tourists crowded around Nelson's column, and pigeons fluttered at their feet. James knelt to tie Winston's leash more securely and looked up at the tall statue. He felt grounded, happy to be part of this lively city. Emma gathered the group for final instructions. "Our tour ends here. Feel free to stay and explore or head back to Green Park Tube Station. Thank you all for being wonderful company."
People applauded softly.
James thanked Emma and said goodbye to the new friends he had made. He clipped Winston's leash and turned toward the station. On the way, he thought of 2 postcards he had bought earlier, one showing the guards in perfect formation, the other showing a cartoonish bulldog in a bearskin hat. He decided to send both to his partner, writing a note, "Thanks for always reminding me to be patient. We both learned something today." He smiled and dropped them into a red pillar box. At the tube station, James pressed his travel card and laughed with Winston as they descended the steps. He felt tired but joyful. London had shown him its history, its gardens, its art, and a lesson in kindness he would never forget. Later, as he lay in his hotel bed, Winston snoring softly on the floor, James replayed the day in his mind. He remembered the shock, the bark, the calm kneel, the salute, the smiles. He felt grateful for every second, drifted into sleep, dreaming of a red-coated guard and a brave bulldog who taught him an unexpected truth, that compassion can shine brightest in the strictest of places, and that a single moment of kindness can echo around the world. ChatGPT said. The next morning, James woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. He sat up in bed, Winston curled at his feet and rubbed his eyes. On the screen, dozens of missed calls and notifications filled his messages app. His friends back. Home had sent him video links, news articles, and laughing emojis. James smiled, remembering the events of the day before. He tapped on one video link and watched the moment again. Winston charging, the guard kneeling, the calm pat on the head. He felt a fresh rush of pride. Winston stretched and let out a sleepy snort. James clipped on the leash and led him down to the hotel lobby, where he had arranged to meet Emma, the tour guide. She waited with a cup of coffee for him at a small table by the window. Emma waved as James and Winston approached. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "I hope you slept well." James nodded and sat down, setting Winston's water dish. On the floor, the bulldog happily drank, while James accepted the coffee Emma offered. "I saw you on the news," Emma said softly. "They're even calling you and Winston the new symbols of London kindness." James laughed. "I can't believe it myself," he admitted. "It feels unreal." Emma leaned forward. "The palace issued a statement this morning," she said, pulling out her tablet. "They said, while we remind all visitors that rules exist for good reasons, we also celebrate moments of empathy and calm, even when protocol is tested." Emma tapped the screen, showing the formal words. From Buckingham Palace's official social media account. James read the statement and felt a mix of pride and relief. The palace had handled it exactly right. Later that day, James and Winston walked through Piccadilly Circus. Giant screens glowed overhead, and one displayed a looping video of the palace incident. The caption read, "Tourist's Bulldog meets Royal Garda, Tale of Calm Triumph." Crowds stopped to watch, smiling and pointing. Children tugged at their parents, asking questions. Tourists near James recognized him and Winston. Some asked for photos. One teenager held out her phone and said, "Can you take a selfie with Winston?" James laughed and agreed. James felt proud of his bulldog. By midday, James had received an invitation to appear on a popular morning show called London Live. The producer's email promised a 15-minute segment for him and Winston to tell the story. James hesitated at first. He was not used. 2 cameras. But Serena, his partner, had called him early this morning and told him to accept. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime chance," she said, "and Winston deserves the spotlight." James agreed, and Emma helped him find the studio address. When they arrived at the TV studio, bright lights and cables surrounded them. Crew members bustled about. Winston sat on a red carpet square, looking curious but calm. James paced a little, nerves fluttering in his stomach. A makeup artist offered to touch up his face. Emma patted his arm, whispering encouragement. "You've got this," she said. James took a deep breath and held Winston's leash tightly. Moments later, they were led onto the set. The host, a friendly woman named Carla, greeted them with a warm handshake. She praised Winston and called him the bravest bulldog in the realm. James laughed as the audience applauded. Carla asked him to replay the incident on screen. The video played, and the audience gasped, and then cheered when the guard patted Winston. Carla turned to James. "How did you feel when your dog charged the guard?" she asked. James smiled, recalling the panic. "I was scared," he admitted. "But I also knew Winston wasn't trying to hurt anyone." And then seeing the guard's calm saved the moment. Carla nodded. That calm response went viral. "How do you feel about your new fame?" James shrugged. "It's strange, but it's nice to see people smile. I hope this shows that kindness can come in unexpected ways." Carla laughed and invited Winston to the desk. Winston bounced up on his hind legs and sniffed at the microphone. Carla fed him a small treat, and the bulldog's tail wagged vigorously. The audience cooed. James patted Winston's head and whispered, "You're a star, buddy." After the show, the producer handed James a framed photo of Winston and the guard from the morning segment. "A gift from the team," she said. James thanked her and tucked the photo into his backpack. Winston sniffed at the bag. James laughed and patted his side. Outside the studio, a small group of fans waited. They held posters that read Winston. "Guard equals forever friends." James signed autographs on their phones, wrote his name under Winston's paw print, and posed for more photos. Winston took it all in with good humor. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Corporal Mitchell's story was also unfolding quietly. His fellow guards had placed the dog treats he requested into a small tin inside the guard room. Every morning before he took up his post, Mitchell slipped a couple of biscuits into his pocket. Tourists with small dogs passed by, and he would offer a treat or two. The palace security staff noted this new practice in their daily log. Some officers grumbled quietly that it broke tradition. Others praised him for making the guards look more human and approachable. Later that week, the palace communications team released a photo of Mitchell offering a treat to a small dog, captioned "A kind gesture from our guard." The image warmed hearts across social media again. James spent the afternoon walking Winston through Covent Garden. Street performers juggled and played music. A mime dressed as a guard stood still by a column, and Winston barked once, causing the mime to break character and wiggle in laughter. James apologized to the mime, who smiled and pretended to offer Winston an imaginary biscuit. James laughed and tipped his cap. Tourists crowded around asking James and Winston to pose with the mime. The scene felt like a grand finale. Later, James visited a local dog shelter where he donated part of the money he earned from a brief paid interview. He had insisted that Winston's fame benefit other dogs. The shelter staff welcomed him warmly. James handed over a check and a bag of supplies. He scratched Winston behind the ears, and the bulldog looked around as if he owned the place. "You, Winston," James said. "You've done good." As evening fell, James and Winston returned to the hotel. James reviewed his messages. Interviews, invitations to charity events, requests from other media outlets poured in. He replied kindly, but decided to limit their engagements to protect Winston from too much stress. Instead, he scheduled a final meet and greet at a local cafe known for welcoming dogs. The next morning, the cafe's patio filled with people and their pets. James arrived with Winston, and the barista saved them the best table. Fans came to say hello. Some brought homemade dog treats as gifts for Winston. Others held little framed photos of him with the guard. James chatted, laughed, and posed for pictures. Winston basked in the affection, wagging his tail and accepting pats. At midday, Emma arrived and joined them. She had heard that Buckingham Palace would host a small reception for James and Winston the next week, a formal invitation to tea on the palace lawn, with Mitchell also invited. James felt a thrill run through him. He read the invitation carefully. It said the guest of honor would be Winston, though James would of course be included. That afternoon, James walked through St. James's Park again, alone this time with Winston. They found the exact spot near the lake where they had paused on the day of the incident. James knelt beside Winston and whispered, "Look how far you've come." Winston leaned in and licked James's hand. James laughed softly. He patted Winston's shoulder and said, "You're a good boy." James thought about the strange journey they had taken. from a near mishap at the palace gates to international fame, from fear to friendship, from a simple dog walk to tea at Buckingham Palace. He felt grateful for every moment and proud that kindness had won the day. As the sun dipped low, James and Winston headed back to their hotel. James glanced at the palace in the distance, its silhouette glowing in the golden light. He imagined the crest of the lion and unicorn above the gates, nodding in approval. He smiled and squeezed the leash gently. Winston looked up at him with those sleepy, wise eyes, as if understanding everything. That night, James fell asleep, dreaming of the palace lawn, teacups, and Anne's famous biscuits. Winston snored softly at his side. Outside, London lights twinkled. The world seemed kinder, a little more open to surprises and gentle gestures. And in James's dreams, a royal guard knelt once more and offered a treat, reminding everyone that sometimes the strongest hearts show their power through calm kindness. James awoke before dawn, his heart beat light with both excitement and calm. Today was the day he and Winston would return to Buckingham Palace, not as frightened tourists or nervous dog owners, but as honored guests. He dressed carefully, choosing a neat shirt and slacks. He ran a brush through his hair, trying to look tidy without stiff formality. Winston sat by the bed, yawning and stretching his short legs. James clipped on the leash and knelt to offer him a small biscuit. Winston's stubby tail wagged once, as if he too understood it was an important morning. The taxi ride to the palace felt shorter than before. James looked out the window at the familiar streets, leafy parks, grand buildings, Londoners hurrying. To work, he remembered his first moments here, the buzz of tourists, the surprise of seeing red-coated guards as if in a storybook. Today, the palace rose ahead, its stone walls lit by the soft glow of morning light. The taxi stopped at the curb, and James stepped out, leash in hand. Winston sniffed at the pavement, but walked calmly beside him. Emma waited by the main gate, her smile warm. She wore a smart coat and held a small gift bag. Inside was a tin of dog biscuits and a card printed with a photo of Winston and Corporal Mitchell. Emma handed the bag to James. "A small token," she said, "from all of us on the tour." James thanked her, tucking the bag under his arm. Winston gave a curious snort and wagged his tail, happy for treats. A uniformed palace usher greeted them. He bowed slightly and led them across the gravel courtyard toward a side entrance. James felt a flutter in his chest. He squeezed Winston's leash to steady himself. Inside, the hall was quiet and cool, lit by chandeliers that cast soft light. On the polished floor, portraits of kings and queens lined the walls. James glanced at each one briefly, faces from history watching this new moment unfold. They emerged onto a wide lawn, trimmed grass stretching toward the palace. A small group of guests in smart but relaxed clothes gathered around a row of tables covered in white cloth. Fine china teacups and saucers sat in neat lines, and silver teapots glinted in the sun. Plates held cucumber sandwiches, scones, and small cakes. A gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers and fresh tea. James and Winston approached the gathering. At the center stood Corporal Mitchell, no longer in his bearskin hat but wearing a smart dressed uniform. He held a small plate with a biscuit. When he saw James, he offered a crisp salute. James returned it, feeling the weight of respect in the gesture. Between them lay a moment of shared history that needed no words. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton," Mitchell said quietly, his voice calm and clear. "And good morning, Winston." James felt a warmth spread through him. He stepped forward and offered Winston a biscuit from the tin Emma had given him. Winston sniffed, then took it gently, crunching happily. Mitchell offered Winston another biscuit from his plate. The bulldog's tail wagged twice, and he leaned into each pat offered by Mitchell. The other guests included a few local dog owners whose pets had shared biscuits from the guard's pocket, a reporter who had kindly chosen to write about calm connections instead of sensational headlines, and a palace gardener who remembered seeing Winston's tracks near the gates on the day of the incident. All greeted James and Winston with friendly smiles. Nobody laughed or pointed. Instead, they welcomed the duo as fellow friends of the palace. James poured tea for himself and for Mitchell, careful to hold the cup by its handle. They stood by a small round table beneath a blossoming cherry tree. Pink petals drifted down like confetti. James lifted the cup to his lips. The tea was light and fragrant. He savored the taste of warm honey and smelled fresh mint. It was a simple pleasure, but in that moment, it felt grand. Mitchell spoke first. "I'm glad you and Winston could join us," he said. "The palace rules are strict, as you know. Yet this moment shows that kindness can guide rules rather than break them." James nodded. "I agree," he said. "I've learned more about respect and calm from you than any guidebook. You taught me that a moment of gentleness can turn fear into friendship." They sipped tea together, and around them the palace staff moved quietly, refreshing teapots and offering small plates. Winston sat at James's feet, content and calm. Occasionally a guest knelt to pet him and whisper kind words. Winston closed, his eyes in pleasure, like a small king enjoying royal favor. Later, James stepped away from the table to look at the lawn. He saw where tour groups usually paused, where he had first lost Winston's leash, where he had run in panic. Now the grass looked greener, gentler, touched by an invisible kindness. He knelt and let Winston sniff a patch of clover. Winston tapped his tail once, then looked up at James as if saying, "Yes, this is good." James rose and walked back to join Mitchell. They exchanged a friendly nod. Emma watched from a bench, smiling proudly at the two men and the dog who had changed a palace moment into a human story. She held her own teacup, untouched since arriving, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me share this." James waved her over, and she sat beside them. The gardener approached next, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers cut from the palace grounds. He handed it to Emma, who then placed it in a vase on the tea table. "For the bulldog hero," the gardener said with a wink. Emma blushed. She handed the bouquet to James. "For Winston," she said. James accepted it gratefully and tucked a few small blooms behind Winston's collar. The flowers bobbed gently as Winston shook his head. As the tea reception wound down, Mitchell announced a small gift ceremony. Each guest in turn came forward, with a token for James and Winston. A child offered a hand-drawn card showing Winston in a guard's uniform. Another gave a small book of London photographs. The reporter presented a framed copy of her front-page story, headlined "Kindness Unmasked." James thanked each person with simple words and a smile. Winston received pats and biscuits, standing patiently for each new friend. At last, Mitchell held a small box wrapped in pale blue paper. He handed it to James. "On behalf of Buckingham Palace," he said, "we offer this to you both." James opened the box carefully. Inside lay two small silver medals, engraved with the palace crest and the date of the palace bulldog incident. One medal was meant for James, the other for Winston. Both bore the words kindness and calm. James's voice caught. He looked at Mitchell, feeling gratitude deep in his chest. "Thank you," James said, surprising himself by almost tearing up. "This means more to me than you know." Mitchell offered a small bow. "You both deserve it," he said, "for reminding us that compassion can be the greatest rule of all." James placed the medal on his shirt pocket and clipped Winston's medal onto his collar. The little silver disc glinted in the sunlight. Winston sniffed it once, then trotted around with it, bouncing gently on his chest. The guests applauded softly, and the moment felt like a gentle wave of warmth washing over the palace grounds. Soon the reception ended. Guests drifted away in pairs, and Emma guided James and Winston toward the exit. The usher opened the door to the courtyard. James paused and looked back at the palace, its walls now familiar friends rather than distant monoliths. He felt a sense of home in a place he had just begun to know. As they stepped outside, an older couple approached them. The woman held out her camera. "May we have one more photo?" she asked. James smiled and posed with Winston by his side. The guard hat from the souvenir stall sat on a small pillar beside them as a playful prop. James patted Winston's head. "Of course," he said. They snapped the photo, and the couple thanked them warmly. The taxi ride back to the hotel felt gentle and quiet. Winston dozed beside James in the back seat. James looked at Winston's medal, shining softly under the car light. He thought of how a small moment of mischief had led to an unexpected friendship, a viral story, and a royal tea. He felt lucky and humbled. Later that day, as James packed his suitcase, he placed Winston's medal carefully on top of his clothes. He packed the photo of Winston and the guard, the framed news article, and the bouquet of wildflowers. He knew these treasures would go home with him as living reminders of kindness. That evening, James and Winston took one last walk through the streets. They passed places they had been during their adventure: Piccadilly Circus, where Winston had posed for selfies; the cafe patio, where fans had brought homemade treats; and St. James's Park, where they had paused to feed ducks. James stopped at each spot and said quietly, "Thank you." Winston sniffed the air and wagged his tail as if he heard James's words. Under the glow of street lamps, James looked up at the palace one final time. Its windows reflected the turning sky, and its gates stood still. Yet James knew its story had changed. It was no longer only the home of kings and queens. It was now a place where a bulldog and a guard had shown the world that calm kindness could break any rule. He felt content, led Winston back to the hotel. The bulldog snuggled onto his bed, metal resting on his chest like a small shield. James sat beside him and stroked his fur. "We did good, buddy," he said softly. Winston closed his eyes and snored softly, dreaming of treats and gentle hands. James turned off the light and lay down on his own bed. He closed his eyes, thinking of the metal's soft weight, the cherry blossom petals, and the sound of polite applause. His heart felt full of peace,